Across the British countryside in May 1945, massive vehicle depots extended for miles around Southampton, Liverpool, and countless other port cities. Thousands upon thousands of American trucks stood in meticulously arranged formations. Their olive-green paint bore the marks of years spent in relentless wartime service. These weren't British-made vehicles. They displayed the characteristic designs of Detroit's manufacturers: Chevrolet's curved hoods, Ford's distinctive flat grills, and the robust construction of GMC and Studebaker. Over 480,000 American trucks and lorries had journeyed across the Atlantic through Lend-Lease. The overwhelming majority were allocated to British military forces. With triumph in Europe achieved and Japan's capitulation only weeks distant, these vehicles created an unprecedented logistical and diplomatic dilemma. The United States government retained ownership. Britain had operated them, serviced them, and exhausted them across battlefields from North Africa through Northwest, yet ownership had never been transferred. As peacetime dawned, pressing questions arose. What would become of nearly 500,000 foreign-owned vehicles distributed throughout Britain and the European continent? Could Britain buy them? Was return mandatory? Would destruction be necessary? The solutions would expose the brutal economic circumstances confronting post-war Britain and decide the destiny of history's largest single-program vehicle assembly. Britain's reliance on American vehicles became unmistakably clear immediately after victory. Between 1941 and 1945, America had delivered 227,284 trucks and lorries to Britain exclusively, with an additional 52,000 dispatched to British Empire forces. These numbers overshadowed Britain's domestic manufacturing output. The vehicles encompassed every classification: 1.5-ton Dodge weapons carriers, 2.5-ton GMC cargo trucks, 4-ton Diamond T-tank transporters, enormous 6-ton white heavy haulage vehicles, Chevrolet 1,500-weight utility trucks, and thousands of specialized variations including ambulances, mobile repair shops, and communications vehicles. These American-made vehicles had constituted the foundation of British logistics throughout the entire conflict. By May 1945, they represented roughly 60% of Britain's complete military truck inventory. The Eighth Army operating in Italy depended on them almost exclusively. The British Second Army stationed in Germany possessed American vehicles outnumbering British models 3-1. Storage facilities within Britain itself contained approximately 180,000 American lorries, while another 120,000 occupied depots throughout France, Belgium, and Germany. Roughly 85,000 remained positioned in the Mediterranean theater. The remainder were dispersed from India to Burma, from Egypt to Palestine. Vehicle conditions varied enormously. Some had traveled less than 5,000 miles, others, especially those in continuous service since North Africa in 1942, displayed 80,000 miles on their odometers and substantial mechanical deterioration. The immediate predicament was simultaneously political and economic. The Lend-Lease Act had always been explicit. Equipment was loaned, never gifted. As warfare concluded, the United States government anticipated either the return of operational equipment or compensation for items Britain desired to keep. American representatives arrived in Britain within weeks following victory in Europe Day to perform evaluations. The Foreign Liquidation Commission, created specifically for managing overseas Lend-Lease disposal, dispatched assessment teams to examine vehicle parks and establish valuations. Their opening position alarmed British representatives. America sought his or vehicle return or payment at depreciated, yet still considerable rates. The Americans suggested that vehicles in excellent condition might cost Britain £400 each, those in acceptable condition £250, and even deteriorated lorries £100. With nearly 500,000 vehicles under British control, the calculations became staggering. Britain, essentially insolvent after 6 years of warfare, couldn't afford purchasing what had become essential to operations. Foreign Office and Treasury representatives rushed to negotiate more advantageous terms. American negotiators, headed by State Department and War Department officials, initially demonstrated minimal flexibility. They emphasized that numerous vehicles, particularly those stationed throughout Britain, remained in serviceable condition and possessed obvious commercial worth. The American automotive industry desired these vehicles returned or eliminated to prevent market competition with post-war manufacturing. Surplus American military trucks flooding European marketplaces might undermine new vehicle sales. Throughout summer 1945, negotiations persisted while the vehicles remained in their parks, requiring guard personnel and weathering in the elements. The British situation grew increasingly dire. Foreign currency reserves had reached dangerously depleted levels. The nation required every dollar for critical food imports and essential raw materials. Allocating hundreds of millions for trucks appeared impossible. Nevertheless, Britain's economy demanded transport capabilities for reconstruction efforts. American officials acknowledged Britain's difficulty but confronted congressional demands to recover Lend-Lease expenditures and safeguard domestic manufacturers. September 1945 witnessed Truman's sudden termination of the Lend-Lease program. The announcement on August 21st stunned British officials. Within days, all Lend-Lease deliveries halted. Items already in transit continued to British harbors, but the supply pipeline emptied completely. This abrupt termination intensified pressure for settlement regarding existing equipment. British negotiators, led by Ministry of Supply and War Office representatives, accelerated discussions with the Foreign Liquidation Commission. The resolution emerged through an innovative accounting methodology. Rather than outright vehicle purchases, Britain negotiated a comprehensive settlement encompassing all Lend-Lease materials to be retained. The Anglo-American Financial Agreement, executed in December 1945, established that Britain would pay £650 million for all Lend-Lease equipment it wished to maintain, including the trucks. This represented approximately 10% of the equipment's original valuation. The settlement allowed Britain to retain vehicles considered essential while mandating disposal of surplus equipment. The agreement stipulated that vehicles retained for military purposes need not be paid immediately, but fell under general loan provisions. Those transferred to civilian applications required payment within the settlement structure. By early 1946, British authorities commenced the enormous undertaking of categorizing nearly 500,000 vehicles. Retention for military service, transfer to civilian ministries, sale to Commonwealth nations, scrapping, or overseas abandonment. The Ministry of Supply established regional processing facilities at Chilwell, Donington, Bester, and additional locations to handle the immense fleet. Teams comprising mechanics and administrators labored through winter 1945 to 46, inspecting, classifying, and documenting each vehicle. Those judged essential for ongoing military service numbered approximately 125,000. These included newer models with minimal mileage, specialized variants difficult to replace, and vehicles required for occupation forces in Germany. Another 92,500 vehicles received authorization for transfer to civilian government applications. The Ministry of Transport acquired thousands for road maintenance operations. The Ministry of Agriculture received lorries for forestry work. Local authorities across Britain obtained American trucks for refuse collection, fire services, and general municipal operations. British military authorities confronted particular difficulties in Germany, where approximately 78,000 American vehicles served with the British Army of the Rhine. The occupation demanded substantial transport capacity. Yet, maintaining such an extensive foreign fleet proved problematic. Spare parts became progressively harder to acquire as American military inventories diminished. The War Office decided to retain about 45,000 American lorries in Germany, primarily newer GMC and Studebaker models, while declaring older vehicles surplus. These surplus vehicles couldn't return to Britain economically. Shipping expenses would exceed their worth. Instead, British authorities began selling them domestically within Germany. The Control Commission for Germany established vehicle disposal facilities in Hamburg, Hanover, and the Ruhr region. German transportation companies, desperately needing vehicles to reconstruct their devastated economy, purchased thousands of worn Chevrolets, Dodges, and Fords. Prices remained modest, typically £50 to £150 per vehicle, depending on condition. By late 1946, approximately 22,000 American trucks, originally supplied to Britain under Lend-Lease, had entered German civilian operation. They became commonplace on German roadways, frequently repainted and displaying German registration plates, silently contributing to reconstruction. Meanwhile, Commonwealth negotiations advanced through 1946. Canada, which had received 237,000 American vehicles under its own Lend-Lease allocation, confronted similar predicaments. Australia had received 44,000. Both dominions negotiated comparable settlements with the United States, paying reduced amounts for retained vehicles. Britain offered to sell portions of its allocation to Commonwealth partners, requiring additional transport capacity. New Zealand purchased 3,400 American lorries from British inventories. South Africa acquired 2,100. India, facing its own transportation shortage, received 8,500 vehicles transferred from British military reserves in the Middle East. The Soviet approach to Lend-Lease vehicles, though not directly comparable, offers fascinating contrast. The Soviets had received approximately 427,000 American trucks under Lend-Lease, nearly identical to Britain's allocation. Unlike Britain, the Soviet Union simply retained everything. When American officials requested accounting and return of surplus equipment, Soviet authorities provided negligible cooperation. Most American vehicles that survived Soviet service remained in Soviet possession, many serving well into the 1950s. Some Studebaker US-6 trucks, particularly favored by Soviet forces, continued in military service until the 1960s. The Soviet refusal to engage meaningfully with Lend-Lease accounting became among many early Cold War tensions. Britain, despite financial desperation, honored the negotiated settlement conditions. This contrast in approaches reflected differing relationships with the United States as the wartime alliance fragmented. Back in Britain, systematic disposal of surplus American vehicles accelerated through 1946 and 1947. The vehicles deemed uneconomical to retain numbered approximately 185,000. These vehicles met various destinies depending on condition and location. Those in reasonable mechanical order but surplus to requirements went to auction. The Ministry of Supply organized sales at depots throughout Britain. Private haulage companies, still recovering from wartime restrictions, purchased thousands of Chevrolet and Ford lorries. Agricultural contractors bought four-wheel-drive Dodges for farm operations. Construction companies acquired Diamond T and white heavy lorries for building projects. Prices ranged from £180 for good-condition 2.5-ton GMCs to £80 for worn Chevrolet utilities. These sales generated approximately £18 million for the Treasury, a modest sum but welcome, given Britain's financial straits. Vehicles in poor condition faced scrapping. The steel shortage confronting British industry in 1946 made scrap metal valuable. Dealers purchased worn-out American trucks for £15 to £30 each, then dismantled them at scrapyards in Birmingham, Sheffield, and South Wales. By 1948, approximately 67,000 former Lend-Lease vehicles had been reduced to scrap metal, their steel feeding Britain's reconstruction. Some vehicles simply proved uneconomical to relocate or process. In remote storage locations, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, clusters of damaged or cannibalized American lorries sat abandoned. The Ministry of Supply lacked resources to transport them to scrapyards. These vehicles gradually deteriorated through the late 1940s, eventually becoming derelict hulks buried by vegetation. Small numbers survived into the 1950s before finally being cleared. The Mediterranean theater presented particular disposal challenges. Approximately 62,000 American vehicles in British service remained in Egypt, Palestine, Libya, and Italy in mid-1945. As British forces reduced presence, these vehicles became surplus. The Middle East Command established disposal centers in Cairo and Alexandria. Thousands of war-worn vehicles went to Egyptian contractors and transport operators. When British forces withdrew from Palestine in 1948, they left behind approximately 8,000 American vehicles, some falling into Israeli hands, others to Arab forces. In Libya, the remnants of desert campaigns littered remote areas. Hundreds of abandoned American trucks, too damaged or remote for recovery, gradually disappeared beneath sand. Civilian integration of retained American vehicles transformed British roads through the late 1940s. The distinctive squared-off profiles of Chevrolet and GMC lorries became common sights. Rural fire brigades operated converted Dodge ambulances. Forestry operations relied on four-wheel drive power wagons. Small haulage firms built businesses around inexpensive surplus American trucks. These vehicles possessed advantages over British lorries of the era. Their straightforward, robust engineering proved easy to maintain. Parts, while not abundant, remained available through specialist dealers who stockpiled components from scrapped vehicles. The powerful engines designed for American conditions coped well with overloading common in post-war Britain. However, fuel consumption proved problematic. American engines designed when petrol was inexpensive and plentiful consumed significantly more fuel than British equivalents. As petrol rationing continued through the late 1940s, this became a serious drawback. Operating costs forced many civilian users to replace their American vehicles with more economical British models by 1950. The military retention fleet faced different challenges. Through 1946 and 1947, the War Office maintained approximately 125,000 American vehicles in military service. Spare parts increasingly constrained operations. The Americans, having disposed of their own surplus stocks by 1948, no longer manufactured parts for wartime models. British military workshops began cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others operational. Engineering units manufactured improvised replacement components. By 1949, the remaining American fleet in British service had declined to 73,000 vehicles. A further reduction occurred in 1950 to 51 as the Ministry of Supply pushed for standardization on British models. The Korean War temporarily extended the service life of some vehicles, particularly heavy lorries, in short supply. But by 1953, the British military had reduced American vehicle holdings to approximately 28,000 units, mostly specialized types or vehicles serving in overseas garrisons, where parts remained available. Several thousand American vehicles found their way into preservation, though rarely through intentional efforts. Museums showed little interest in common military lorries during the 1940s and 1950s. However, vehicles passing into civilian service sometimes survived through continued use. Small haulage firms, municipal services, and agricultural operations occasionally retained American trucks well beyond their economic life, particularly if they developed maintenance expertise. A few examples entered museum collections by the 1960s. The Imperial War Museum acquired a GMC CKW 2.5-ton lorry in 1967, one that had served throughout Northwest Europe. The National Motor Museum at Beaulieu later obtained a Dodge Double C Series weapons carrier. The Tank Museum at Bovington preserves a Diamond T-tank transporter, one of the massive vehicles that had moved British armor from Normandy to the Rhine. Private collectors began seeking American military vehicles from the 1970s onwards. As military vehicle preservation became an established hobby, enthusiasts discovered surviving examples in farm sheds, scrapyards, and municipal depots. A Studebaker US-6 emerged from a Scottish forestry depot in 1982, still in running condition after decades of timber hauling. Recovery efforts in remote areas occasionally yield discoveries. Several American vehicles abandoned in the Scottish Highlands during post-war training exercises have been recovered and restored. Today, British military vehicle collections hold approximately 85 examples of American Lend-Lease lorries in various conditions. These represent perhaps 0.02% of the original fleet. The Wiltshire-based Military Vehicle Trust operates several restored GMCs and Dodges at shows and events. Private collectors own perhaps 200 additional examples, mostly Dodge weapons carriers, and Jeeps, though Jeeps formed a separate program from the truck allocation. Continental Europe holds additional survivors. German museums preserve several American trucks that entered civilian service after 1945. The Overloon War Museum in the Netherlands displays a GMC recovered from a local haulage firm. The Auto and Technik Museum in Sinsheim, Germany, exhibits an intact Ford GAT that served in British military service before German civilian use. The legacy of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks extends beyond the physical vehicles. The experience fundamentally shaped post-war British military vehicle development. British manufacturers studied American design approaches intensively. The simplicity and standardization of American vehicles impressed British engineers who had dealt with numerous incompatible British models during the war. When Britain developed its next generation of military lorries in the 1950s, including the Bedford RL series, American influence showed clearly in simplified maintenance features and standardized components. The financial settlement of Lend-Lease vehicles also created lasting policy impacts. The experience taught British officials harsh lessons about dependency on foreign equipment. The requirement to negotiate retention terms while effectively bankrupt influenced British defense policy for decades. Subsequent governments prioritized maintaining domestic production capacity for essential military equipment, even at higher costs, to avoid similar vulnerability. The rapid disposal and disappearance of nearly 500,000 vehicles also demonstrates how quickly even massive programs can vanish from the landscape. Within 5 years of war's end, the vast majority had been scrapped, sold, or abandoned. Within 10 years, remaining examples had become unusual sights. Within 20 years, they had become rare. This pattern would repeat with much Cold War military equipment. Enormous investments that disappeared within decades of obsolescence. The story of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks reveals the unglamorous but essential logistics of war's aftermath. The dramatic moment of victory in May 1945 gave way to years of administrative processing, financial negotiation, and systematic disposal. The race to secure German technology might capture more attention, but the fate of 500,000 ordinary lorries tells a more fundamental story about post-war Britain. The country emerged victorious but financially exhausted, unable even to purchase the vehicles it had worn out in service. The Americans, while ultimately generous in settlement terms, still insisted on payment or return. The solution involved creative accounting, mass disposal, and acceptance that the enormous vehicle fleet would largely disappear. Today, the few surviving examples serve as tangible reminders of the scale of Allied cooperation and the logistical foundations that underpinned victory. The GMC and Studebaker lorries displayed in British museums represent not just vehicles, but the industrial might that sustained armies across continents. They also remind us how thoroughly the material evidence of even recent history can vanish when economic and practical considerations drive disposal.